Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you all for joining us, and I found the testimony very valuable. Let me start with a question for Mr. Weber. Your testimony points to specific harms that come from predetermined levels of fines authorized by the CCPA. Acknowledging that some privacy laws like CCPA currently provide minimal small business carve-outs, it is still absolutely necessary for any federal privacy enforcement authority to consider certain metrics to ensure appropriately proportioned penalties, including the size of the business, the availability of resources, and the scope and sensitivity of the data and its data processing practices. If first-time civil penalty authority is on the table for federal legislation, would you agree that these factors should be taken into account? In addition to those factors, what others might need to be included?
Yeah, I think for the ones that are already available for us to use as a metric to compare against, like GDPR or CCPA, I mean, that's a huge concern that it's kind of a first time and you're immediately fined. And the guidelines they represent regarding millions of dollars or percentage of revenue, that, again, is a death blow to these companies. But for a small business, and again, how we define that business is going to be a challenge. I think maybe in tech, it is different than what the SBA defines as a small business in America because for a number of different reasons. But yeah, I mean, there's a potential, and I think a good impact, where a first offense taking a bit of a warning would be extremely helpful to particularly startups. Any fine that would be distributed for, or say from the FTC, would essentially make them able to really scale from there. It'd be very hard to find investors, customers, users, and reputational risk would be an all-time high.
Thank you. Let me turn to the realtor. I'll call you Madam Vice Chairman. How can policymakers ensure that anyone who handles sensitive information, Social Security numbers, substantial amounts of consumer financial information, as I would expect a realtor to do so, is not going to share that information with unknown third parties or use it in ways that's harmful to the consumer?
Sure. So realtors do not collect sensitive personal information. The data that we collect on our consumers is more just their personal contact information and maybe their preferences on the types of properties and features that they like in the property. But we do not collect personal information. The lender usually handles that.
So you would be safe and secure from at least part of the components of any legislation that we might pass.
Correct.
And that's, I guess, the point, is that you ought to be treated differently.
That's right.
Somebody who does collect that kind of information.
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Engstrom, in particular startup businesses, that community, would you describe for me the concerns associated with providing a private right of action in a federal consumer privacy law?
Yes, thank you for the question, Senator. It's certainly one of the aspects of CCPA that we're most concerned about, mostly because whenever you combine a private right of action that is untethered to any actual harm suffered, in the CCPA they have statutory damages available for any data breach, plus a sort of ambiguous liability threshold in CCPA, it's reasonable security practices, you're opening up the door for lengthy litigation, and that's the real concern here. Because once you have a data breach, and frankly, no matter what companies do, there's always the risk that something bad will happen. That it's a truism in this industry that it's not a question of if you'll run into a problem with security, it's when. And we want to encourage companies to do the best thing possible and implement the best security measures possible, but that's generally not a determination you can make early in a litigation. So for most companies, anytime something happens, no matter how responsible you were, the threat of statutory damages not tied to any actual harm is going to require a long litigation that's going to, frankly, bankrupt a company if they win or they lose, because there are no attorney's fees associated in CCPA. So I think the risk of inviting litigation that's going to drag out and drain a company's resources is a very real threat.
What are the factors that cause your sentence? I have no doubt but what it's true that says that there's going to be a breach, there's going to be a privacy invasion. What's the factors in the environment that make that sentence true?
So I think any time, particularly as CCPA requires, you're going to have to collect more information. So if you're a company and you have to say verify the identity of a user in order to comply with a deletion request, which is what CCPA envisions, you're now having to collect more information about that user in order to identify this is actually you seeking the deletion of your information. Now that's a great deal of info that you're holding, valuable info. It's going to attract bad actors. You see sort of inadvertent mistakes, no matter how good faith, in what good faith you're operating in, sometimes bad stuff happens. It doesn't happen across the board, but it is a very real risk when you're talking about important, vast stores of information online.
That information is so valuable to other people that there's so many who want to obtain it.
It's certainly
the risks are great, right?
Senator, absolutely, it can be, and people might just want to see what you have ultimately, even if it's not valuable.
Mr. England, your company operates in at least 2 states, maybe more. If every state in which you operated passed its own consumer privacy law, how complicated would compliance be? You talked about this in your testimony. Any ability to expand on that?
Sure. Thank you, Senator. You're absolutely right. We do operate in both Idaho and in Wyoming, and if each of those states had their own separate privacy protection laws and legislation around how to treat that information, it would create administrative burdens for our organization because, for the obvious reasons, that we'd have to staff people with expertise and knowledge and understanding around each of the frameworks within each of the locations. It would perhaps change workflow processes within how we service those customers. And it's precisely why I listed it as one of our top 3 concerns about any legislation, is that it would have the federal nature that would preempt any state legislation.
Before I turn to Senator Blumenthal, let me get on the record this question of preemption, it's an important one that we're going to be trying to find a solution to. Would your organizations and businesses that they represent support federal legislation to preempt inconsistent state privacy laws in the interest of providing clear privacy expectations and protect consumers? Mr. Weber?
Yes, Senator Lee would.
Mr. Engstrom?
Yes, Senator.
Yes, Senator.
Yes.
Inconsistent ones, sure, but the states still need to be allowed to innovate for things that are not covered by a federal law.
Okay. Senator Blumenthal?